Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and talk about a pretty fascinating, honestly kind of mind-blowing structural reality. If you were born between 1980 and 2000, it's highly likely you grew up inside a massive historical anomaly. Seriously, you grew up during what was arguably the most peaceful, stable, and economically integrated era in all of human history. But well, that era of stability we all just kind of took for granted. It's officially over. The invisible scaffolding that literally held our world together for decades is actively fracturing right now. So why did global stability suddenly break? Think about it. We went from the sheer unbridled optimism of the 1990s, the fall of the Berlin Wall, booming shopping malls, this feeling of unprecedented global integration. And now we make up to a daily barrage of flashing red stock tickers, massive tariff walls, drone swarms, and totally decoupled supply chains. We are rapidly moving away from a world run by a single superpower into what experts are calling a multi-order or multipolar reality. And mathematically speaking, a world with multiple bosses just means drastically less stability. For about 3 decades, the rules of the game were remarkably simple. Borders were largely fixed. Free trade was basically treated as an unquestioned religion. The US dollar was the undisputed global currency, and the United States acted as the ultimate guarantor of global security. Political scientists called this the order. In fact, this formula was so incredibly successful that some thinkers back then arrogantly called it the end of history. They genuinely assumed humanity had finally figured out the permanent magic formula for global peace. But as we all know, history absolutely did not end. To understand exactly why the system that brought us decades of peace suddenly stopped working, we are going to look at the 3 cracks breaking the world. Crack number 1, the hyperpower retreat. This starts with the very foundation of the old order, which was, quite frankly, bought and paid for by the United States. You see, the post-World War II global order didn't just magically manifest out of thin air. To win the Cold War, the U.S. essentially struck a grand bargain with the rest of the world. The deal was this: America would secure the global oceans, absorb foreign exports, and provide a massive military umbrella. In exchange, the rest of the world played by American rules and adopted its financial system. But here's the crucial point. Maintaining that global connective tissue had a fatal flaw built right into it. It required the United States to permanently want to be the world's policeman. And today, America is exhausted. Over the last decade or so, we've seen a profound shift in public and political sentiment, whether it's through inward-looking industrial policies or active structural pullbacks from international bodies. Washington has signaled a very clear transition toward an America-first posture. It literally comes down to the mathematical reality of geopolitics. When the sole superpower steps back to focus on domestic challenges, a massive vacuum opens up. Historically, global stability only works when the cost of breaking international rules is way, way higher than the reward. For 30 years, the threat of U.S. military intervention, or getting completely disconnected from the SWIFT banking system, deterred bad behavior. But as the U.S. retreats, that cost absolutely plummets. And when the cat is away, emerging powers naturally begin rewriting the rules to favor themselves. Which brings us to crack number 2, the rise of the rest. We have to shift our focus to the economic map of the planet. When the current international rules were written way back at the 1945 Bretton Woods Conference, much of the world simply didn't even have a seat at the table. The legacy institutions that still run global governance today, like the IMF, the World Bank, and the UN Security Council, they were designed by a tiny handful of Western nations to fit their own ideals. Just think about the sheer demographics for a second. The Western core, or the G7, makes up less than 10% of the global population today. Meanwhile, a massive 85% of the world resides in the global South and emerging markets. The institutions running the whole show just don't reflect the actual populations living in it anymore. Just think about the sheer demographics for a second. The Western core, or the G7, makes up less than 10% of the global population today. Meanwhile, a massive 85% of the world resides in the global south and emerging markets. The institutions running the whole show just don't reflect the actual populations living in it anymore. Nations across Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East are no longer content just being passive rule takers. They are active, ambitious rule makers now. So while the Western core still holds concentrated wealth and those legacy institutions, it's the global South that is now the primary driver of 21st century economic dynamism. And crucially, they are the source of the world's essential raw materials. What this creates is this fascinating new era of multi-alignment diplomacy. Instead of picking sides like in the Cold War, countries like India, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil are flat out refusing to choose exclusively between the West and the East. They are actively playing great powers against each other to get the absolute best deals. They're building alternative financial networks to bypass the US dollar, and they're forming their own development banks. Concurrently, China has heavily leaned into this, using global governance initiatives to position itself as an alternative leader for a post-Western world. In a multipolar reality, every single transaction has to be constantly renegotiated, simply because there is no longer a central judge. And that takes us to crack number 3, weaponizing global trade. This one exposes the fatal flaw in the core thesis of globalization itself. For decades, the prevailing wisdom was that if we just tied our economies together tightly enough, war would become absolutely impossible because it would guarantee mutual economic suicide. The logic sounded bulletproof on paper, right? If Germany relies on Russian gas, the US relies on Chinese manufacturing, and China relies on American microchips. Everyone is heavily incentivized to just keep the peace. But we completely forgot that interdependency is a double-edged sword. When nations suddenly realize those very dependencies make them dangerously weak, the dynamic flips entirely. Suddenly, geopolitical ambitions begin to heavily outweigh the pain of economic disruption. Because of this, we are literally witnessing the death of unconditional free trade. Over the last few years, a severe case of economic paranoia has swept the globe. Corporations and governments are frantically pivoting away from just-in-time logistics, which was all about absolute cost efficiency, to a strict just-in-case mindset. This means heavily prioritizing national security. They're doing this by reshoring supply chains back home, or friendshoring them to trusted allied nations. So what is the real so what here for your daily life? Well, the cost of protection is steep. We're seeing massive tariffs imposed on electric vehicles and solar panels, and severe restrictions on the export of advanced AI chips. When a global system prioritizes security over efficiency, everything fundamentally becomes more expensive. Reversing globalization is a structurally inflationary process, and that means the universally cheap consumer goods we've all enjoyed for the last 30 years, they are quickly becoming a relic of the past. The world is transforming from an open global marketplace into a series of heavily fortified economic fortresses. Now it is incredibly easy to look at this shift, a world with fractured supply chains and fading international law, as a total catastrophe. But history actually tells us that world orders are never permanent. They're only temporary structures built to manage specific historical eras. The 1945 order managed the post-war era. The 1989 order managed the collapse of communism. Today, we aren't necessarily facing the apocalypse. We are simply transitioning into a new patchwork world. To adapt to this friction, we just have to accept that the 21st century is going to be messier, much more fragmented, and highly multinodal. Global influence can no longer be assumed by default by any one country. It has to be earned transaction by transaction, issue by issue. And make no mistake, this shift directly impacts your daily reality, from the interest rates on your savings account to the price of the smartphone right there in your pocket. Nostalgia simply will not bring back the old rules. There is a thought from the source material that perfectly captures this structural reality. It says, the stability we took for granted wasn't the natural state of human affairs. It was an exception. And as the tide of that 30-year historical exception finally goes out, We are all going to have to learn how to swim in a much more turbulent, unpredictable ocean. I want to leave you with this final, critical question to ponder as we close out this explainer. Do you think a multipolar world will ultimately be fairer by giving more nations a voice, or will it just be inherently more dangerous? I highly encourage you to dig deeper into how these tectonic shifts in global power will reshape our future. Thank you so much for joining me for this breakdown, and keep your eyes open, because the world is changing fast.